This is a re-upload due to monetization issues, and also because I need an extra day or two for the next new episode, because my mouth is filled with blisters. No, I don't have the herpes, and I didn't chew on razor blades, but apparently when I eat something that doesn't agree with me, my mouth breaks out with painful canker sores. Makes it very difficult and fun to talk. I'll be back soon. Thank you for your understanding. The Catskills get their name possibly from Catskills, which is Dutch for Wildcat Creek. But that could just be hearsay. Perhaps one thing is certain, at least the kill part of Catskills, that is. Welcome to Camping Horrors, the podcast where real people share their terrifying experiences while camping or hiking, and I narrate them. Today's episode features a disturbing unknown entity in the Catskills, a bizarre unknown creature in the woods, and more. Enjoy. I would love to read your scariest camping and hiking stories on the show, so send them to me at darkstories.org. Go to eeriecast.com to check out more of my scary story narrations. Now, throw a log on the fire, because the night is still young. Warning. The following story contains depictions of violence against pets. Something in the trees. From Living Forest. This particular story happened when I was a teenager, so it was over 15 years ago. I grew up in the Adirondacks, spending most of my childhood and teenage years, camping or just generally being outside in some capacity. 2 summers in a row, I joined a group that would travel around the rural backroads and pick up any garbage. Mostly it was just a cleaning up job, usually along the roadside. Occasionally, however, we would be asked by the rangers to clean up trails or county roads where people would dump their trash in the woods. On that day, the group I was in had to split up and take quadrants. We were given GPS units. However, back then, their accuracy was usually within 100 meters, if you were lucky. Wasn't an issue for me, as I had dreams of being a trail guide or forest ranger back then. However, others were uncomfortable and chose to stay closer to the main roads, which left me having to be dropped off at the end of the Forest Service Road, walking my way back to the agreed area of pickup. We each were given a roll of garbage bags and a poke stick to collect the trash. The area I was dropped off at was known for being one of the larger dump sites. People would drop off their old couches or chairs, even sometimes mattresses, and other various pieces of furniture. But someone with a flatbed truck had already come through, picking up the larger pieces. All that was left were the smaller items, such as bottles, cans, bags, papers, anything along those lines. Unfortunately, once in a while, you would find things dumped of a darker nature, such as unwanted pets that were, let's just say, taken care of in an inhumane way. And on that day, I happened to come across a litter of puppies. I wasn't given a radio, but if I had the radio, I would have called it in. They would come and get me at that point as they tried to keep us youths from seeing the more serious things. This wasn't the first time I've seen things of this nature, unfortunately. So I took the time to collect all the puppies, putting them in a bag. Instead of leaving them with the pile of other bags I'd already filled, I decided to bury the poor things. I dropped off my backpack of supplies and my poke stick near the road. I walked into the woods with just the bag. I walked probably 20-ish minutes away from the road before I found a rather large pine tree that looked like a good resting place for these guys. I put the bag at the bottom of the tree, and I started to walk in a slow circle around it, searching for a stick or rock or similar items that I could use to start making the hole. I found a rather large branch, which I was able to break in half. I then used my pocket knife that I always carried to sharpen one end. I went back to the tree, and I started digging out the hole. It took a while, as there were several roots I had to work my way around. Once I dug a hole about 1.5 feet deep, I proceeded to lay the ill-gotten quarry to rest, without the bag as I didn't want to add to the trash already out there. I took a few moments, even teared up a bit, and prayed. Seeing abuse of any kind is always hard. However, as I was covering up the grave, I heard a small branch fall about 50-ish feet to my left. The position I was in kept me from being able to see because of the branches of the tree I was crouched below. I quit talking and moving and just listened for any further sounds. It wasn't one of those the forest went quiet types of moments. There were still birds out there making their noises, though they were off on the opposite side, farther away from where the sound came from. I didn't notice the change in the birds' sounds from being around me to being away from me in a different area, in my distracted state. After sitting there for about 3 minutes, quietly looking around and trying to look through the branches to my left, I didn't see anything, so I continued to work. After I'd completed covering them up and left several pine cones and a nice-looking rock I'd found, I got up and started to walk away. It was at that time I heard what could only be described as a moan mixed with a growl. This was bear country, but there are some cougars in the area too. So my first concern was that a natural predator had smelled and come to investigate. I only had my pocket knife as any form of self-defense. I wasn't really scared yet, as I assumed it was two trees rubbing against one another in the wind. That is rather common out here in the forest. Looking around, I found nothing once again, but just as I was about to keep walking, I saw a branch and bark come falling down from a tree, about 30 yards from the big pine tree that I'd just left. I looked up the tree as it was only about half the size of the big pine tree, and midway up, I saw something that I don't have a great description for. It looked like it was a brown, gray-green color. It had no obvious shape to describe, and it was probably the size of a bear cub. Immediately I jumped, cursing as I did. I turned around and took several steps backwards, still keeping my eyes on whatever that was. I couldn't tell if it was something alive or not. But then it began to move, and I could tell it was something that was not part of the tree. Honestly, I can't tell you what I saw. It didn't have fur like a bear or mountain lion, but it wasn't skin either. It looked almost like living moss. But as far as I know, the Adirondacks don't have anything like sloths, and that thing didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. I couldn't tell if it had a head or a face until it turned and looked at me. It had a face, but it was squished, kind of. I couldn't see eyes or facial features, other than it being dark. Excuse my lack of details. I was around 80 feet from the thing, and it was up a tree. It was mildly cloudy that day, and if you've ever been in the woods, you know that there's always shade from the canopy, so I couldn't get good eyesight on the thing. I could tell, however, it had 4 limbs, as they were wrapped around the tree, paws that were almost raccoon-like, but the claws on it were about as long as the fingers. It also had a long rat-like tail that was about the length of its body. The tail would occasionally swish back and forth. I watched it climb down the tree slowly, and it watched me the whole time. That's when I noticed it had soft rounded-like ears on the side of its face, like a human, not like an animal. It made no sound as it came down, except for the light scraping of claws. It came to a branch about 12 feet off the ground and climbed out onto it. The thing moved like a raccoon, really, but the shape of the body and the rounded head with seemingly no neck made me sure it was no raccoon. It wasn't even a bear or any other animal I could think of, like a fisher, because it had no snout poking out. Its face was smushed with a nose that looked like holes, but not any obvious shape. Vaguely, it was kind of like a monkey. Its eyes were a lighter color as it caught the sun on occasion. Its skin or whatever covering it looked like it could blend in as a growth on a tree or a rock on the ground. Suddenly, it let out a low-pitched whistle. That's when I decided I'd seen enough. I glanced backward to make sure my path was clear, and turned and pretty much ran. I looked back several times to be certain, but I wasn't followed, and I never did see it again. To this day, I wonder what it was. I told the ranger in charge of us that day what I saw. He said it was probably a raccoon with mange, and when I said the face didn't look like any raccoon I'd seen, he said I must have been mistaken. Its face was similar to that of a snub-nosed monkey, but the color and overall proportions and shapes weren't. There are no known monkey species in North America, and it wasn't an escaped exotic pet. I don't have an answer to what I saw that day. It was clearly comfortable climbing trees, so still to this day, I look up every time I'm in the woods. I don't know if any creature or species matches what I saw, and have spent years researching it on and off. This may not be the scariest story, but it's definitely one of the stranger ones I have. The Catskills Kills from Neverever. It was the summer of 2019. I had just graduated from college. I wanted to do something big before starting my new job, at least something fun, so I decided to go on a solo backpacking trip in the Catskill Mountains for a week. I am an experienced hiker and camper, having grown up in the Adirondacks, so I wasn't too worried about being out in the wilderness alone. The first couple of days of the trip were great. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, but not too hot. I would hike about 8 to 10 miles each day, taking in the beautiful scenery. I even saw some other hikers and backpackers, but for the most part, I was on my own out there. On the third day, things started to feel a bit strange. I soon noticed the birds and other wildlife seemed much quieter than before. The few hikers I did come across didn't return my friendly smiles or hellos. They looked concerned, ready to leave. I chalked this up to getting further out into the backcountry, but it did leave me with an unsettled feeling. That night at my campsite, next to a creek, I built a fire, but I barely needed it. The night remained warm, and I left my tent open to let in the fresh air. As I was falling asleep, I thought I heard footsteps outside and the crunching of leaves. I sat up, listening closely, but didn't hear anything else unusual, just some normal nighttime forest sounds. Still, it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day I continued my hike, climbing up and out of the valley I'd been in. The terrain got rockier and the trees thicker. I felt I was being watched, though I never did see anyone. I shook off the creepy feeling as just nerves from being alone so long. As dusk fell, I set up my tent in a clearing on a ridge with views of the surrounding peaks. I cooked dinner, cleaned up, and settled in for the night. A full moon illuminated the inside of my tent, creating strange shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Exhausted from the long hike, I eventually dozed off. Sometime later, I awoke suddenly. My tent shook violently, the poles bending and collapsing on top of me. I struggled to get out, certain that a bear had decided to attack in the middle of the night. But when I emerged, there was nothing there. Despite the tent poles being mangled, the fabric was untouched. The night was still and quiet, bathed in moonlight. Confused and rattled, I righted the tent as best I could and tried to get back to sleep. In the morning, I packed up quickly, wanting to get away from that exposed ridge. The warm weather had broken overnight, and a chill hung in the air. Dark clouds rolled in as I hiked downhill. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I picked up my pace, hoping to make it to the next shelter before the storm hit. The sky opened up just as the shelter came into view ahead. I sprinted the last 100 yards up to the empty lean-to, my relief at having made it short-lived. As I caught my breath and took off my raincoat, I noticed the shelter had changed. Handprints and claw marks had scraped along the inside walls, Filthy rags littered the floor. The fire pit contained charred bones and smelled of burned hair and flesh. I backed away from the shelter, my heart pounding. The wind whipped up, screaming through the trees. Then I saw it. A hulking shadow lumbering through the woods towards me. I had no choice. I turned and ran into the storm. Icy rain pelting my face. Thunder crashed overhead. I slipped on the muddy trail, but kept going, sweater nagging on branches as I careened wildly downhill. The thing crashed after me, closing in. I burst out of the trees into a rocky clearing, just as lightning struck right behind. The deafening crack reverberated through my body. I froze and slowly turned around. The woods were still again as the wind died down. Raindrops dripped from the leaves. No sign of the thing chasing me. Did I just imagine the whole thing? Exhausted and soaked, I located a small cave tucked into the rocks where I could wait out the storm as the wind picked back up. I squeezed into the farthest corner, wrapping my arms around my knees, shivering uncontrollably. Eventually, the rain tapered off, and I emerged to survey my surroundings. It would be dark soon. I needed to find a safe place to make camp. Numb with cold and fear, I stumbled on, flinching at every swaying branch and rustling bush. As I passed through a dense part of the forest, I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I knew I was being watched again. My breath quickened, and I broke into a jog. The sun slipped below the ridge as I hurried down the trail, shadows stretching across the path. Rounding a corner, I collided with something solid but soft. Reeling backward, I looked up, only to see a pale, demonic face with black holes for eyes. Rotten fangs jutted from its gaping maw as it loomed over me, whatever it was. I screamed and turned to run, but these gnarled hands clutched at my shoulders, and I felt claws dig into my skin. Fetid breath washed over me as the creature opened its mouth impossibly wide, as if ready to devour me whole. Everything went black then. I must have passed out, because when I came to, I was alone on the dark trail. That thing, if it was real, was now gone. I struggled to my feet, grabbing my gear and taking off down the mountain. Twigs snapped behind me, spurring me on faster. I flew over the rocks and roots, branches ripping my skin. Just get back to the car, I told myself. Bursting from the trees, I saw the parking area below me. I half stumbled, half slid down the last stretch of trail and sprinted for my car. I threw everything into the back seat, started the engine, locked the doors, and took off down the winding mountain road. Even from inside the car, I could hear screaming echo off the dark forest, whipping past my vehicle. Who or what the screams came from, I'll never know. I drove all through the night to get back home, not stopping until I pulled into my driveway. I abandoned all my gear in my car and just ran right inside, collapsing on the couch as the sun came up. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered out there, but I'll never venture into those woods again. I think something evil lurks there, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker who dares to wander that trail alone. A Wrong Choice. From Secret Werewolf. I was 17 years old when this happened. There was a full moon in the night sky, casting an eerie glow across the dense forest as I hiked through the woods with some friends, Tom and Sarah. At first, it was a beautiful autumn evening, but as the sun was fully consumed by the horizon, the woods became more sinister. And, before long, a sense of foreboding settled over us. Seeing my friends obviously creeped out, I told them, "Come on, guys, don't be such wimps. It's just a little darkness, and some howling wolves, possibly. What could go wrong?" Tom, the more adventurous of us, was the one who initially convinced us to go on this nighttime hike, claiming it would be a memorable experience. But now, as the shadows grew longer and the forest seemed to close in around us, even I couldn't help but regret my decision. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since we entered the woods, finally said something. "Danny, I'm not so sure about this. It's way too quiet out here. I've heard stories about strange things happening in these woods during a full moon, too." I had heard the stories as well. Mysterious disappearances of pets, sightings of strange figures and silhouettes. I always thought they were superstitions. However, as we continued deeper into the woods, a chill crept up my spine. "Sarah, relax," Tom said, putting his arm around her. "It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. Besides, Danny's gonna protect us, right?" I forced a smile, trying to hide my unease. "Yeah, don't worry, Sarah. I'll make sure nothing happens to you." We continued walking in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional hoot of an owl, the only sounds in the otherwise still night. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. I couldn't help but feel like we weren't alone out there. As we walked, we came across an old, overgrown trail that we'd never seen before. It was hidden well behind a thick tangle of brambles and fallen branches. Tom's eyes lit up with excitement. "Hey, check this out, guys," he said, pointing to the hidden trail. "This could be a shortcut back to the car. Let's take it." Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we followed Tom as he began to hack away at the underbrush with a pocket knife. As we cleared a path, I couldn't shake the feeling we were walking into something that we shouldn't. The farther we went down the trail, the denser the forest became. It was like the trees were closing in around us, and I could no longer see the moon or the stars through the thick canopy. The air grew cooler, and a strange, musty scent filled our nostrils. "Tom, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Tom hesitated for a moment, looking back at us. "We've come this far. We might as well see where it leads. It's got to lead somewhere eventually, right?" Reluctantly, we continued down the trail, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The darkness seemed all-consuming, and I felt a growing sense of unease, like a weight pressing down on my chest. As we walked, I noticed strange marks on the trees, deep claw-like gouges that looked fresh. I pointed them out to Tom and Sarah. "Probably just bears or something," Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced himself. "Are there bears around here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think there are, but usually they keep to themselves," I replied, trying to reassure her. We continued walking, the marks in the trees becoming more frequent. I could not shake the feeling we were being watched, and I wished we had turned back when we had the chance. It felt like the forest had swallowed us whole, and I had no idea where we were or how to get back to the main trail. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a dilapidated, long-abandoned cabin. The roof had partially caved in, and the windows were shattered. It looked like something out of a thriller or horror film. "Why on earth would anyone build a cabin way out here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer for her. The whole situation had taken on a surreal, nightmarish quality, and I was beginning to fear that we had made a terrible mistake by venturing off the main trail. Tom, always the adventurer, couldn't resist exploring the cabin. "Come on, guys, let's check it out. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something cool inside." Reluctantly, we followed him into that cabin. The door creaked open with a deafening noise, and I winced. I prayed we didn't disturb someone or something inside. The interior was empty and silent, save for the wind that whistled through the broken windows. The moonlight spilled into the cabin, revealing a layer of dust and cobwebs that covered everything. It was clear that no one had been in there in a very long time. As we moved further inside, I noticed something strange. A series of odd scratch marks in the cabin's wooden walls. "Guys, look at this," I said, pointing at the marks. Tom came over and examined them. "Those are definitely not from animals. They look human." A shiver ran down my spine as the realization sank in. Someone must have been here recently, leaving these marks. We need to get out of here, now. As we turned to leave, a low, guttural growl echoed from outside the cabin. The three of us froze, our hearts pounding. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. "I don't know, but it didn't really sound like an animal," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom, ever the brave one, moved toward the door, peering outside. "I don't see anything, but we need to go. Whatever it was too close for comfort." We made our way back outside, and as we retreated from that cabin, the growling sound grew louder, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being hunted. The moon, now high in the sky, bathed the forest in an eerie, silvery light. My friends looked scared, just like I felt. As we hurried back down the trail, the growling seemed to be getting closer. My heart raced. Every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of fear through my body. I don't think I'd ever been so scared before. Without warning, a dark shape burst out of the underbrush, lunging at us. It was this massive creature. Its fur was matted, and its eyes glowed in otherworldly malevolence. As I really took in what I was looking at, all I could really think was werewolf. My mind instantly compared it to similar forms and shapes I'd seen before, and this creature happened to resemble the werewolves I've seen in some movies. Tom shouted, "Run!" waking me from my stupor. We sprinted down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us. That furry thing was uncannily fast. Its heavy footsteps and ragged breathing echoed in our ears. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. As we ran, the forest was a blur of trees and moonlight. Even so, I could hear the creature gaining on us, its growling growing louder and more frenzied. I didn't know how much longer we could keep it up, let alone stay ahead of it. I turned back one time to look at it. It looked like someone put a wolf's face on a human's body, indeed what I'd seen from scary movies. A werewolf. No matter how many times I tried to deny it, that's what it looked like. As we neared the end of the trail, I risked another glance over my shoulder. The beast was almost on us, its yellow eyes locked on mine. A bizarre feeling came over me, the idea that I was first to be targeted. If it did catch up to us, would I be torn apart first? The creature's snout snarled, revealing far too much drool. I pushed myself beyond my limits, running faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We burst out of the trail and back onto the main path. And without looking back this time, I could hear the creature's enraged howling. Because for some reason, it had stopped pursuing us, and yet it sounded so angry. I think it knew it couldn't follow us beyond the boundary of that hidden trail, but for what reason, I can't be sure. We ran all the way back to the car. Suddenly, our breathless crying turned into laughter. I think we were just relieved. We had narrowly escaped some monster that shouldn't even be real. As we drove away from those woods, I couldn't help but think about the legends and stories I'd dismissed as superstition. The memory of those glowing yellow eyes would haunt my dreams for years. We never spoke of that night to anyone, fearing that no one would believe the story. But the three of us knew. It was a secret we would carry with us to the grave. But at last I have had the urge to share it somewhere. At least this way it's anonymous. I've often wondered about that supposed werewolf. Why did it attack us? Why couldn't it leave the trail? Was it by itself? Maybe it was cursed to roam the woods under the full moon. I hate the idea that it may have been a part of a larger pack. I may never know the answers to these questions, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll be avoiding those woods for good, especially on full moon nights. The hike to my grandparents, from Shrekbrek. Growing up in rural Utah, I spent a lot of time outdoors, exploring the forests and canyons around my family's large property. By the time I was 13, I knew those woods like the back of my hand. That familiarity gave me a sense of freedom, but also recklessness. Looking back, I was too comfortable out there alone. I thought nothing could harm me. How wrong I was. It started the summer before 8th grade. With school out, I had a lot of unsupervised free time while my parents were at work. I quickly grew bored, just hanging around the house all day. My grandparents lived about 1.5 miles away through the woods, so I decided to start hiking over there some afternoons for a change of scenery and to raid their pantry. The first few times I made the hike were uneventful. Their house backed right up to the tree line, so I'd emerge from the woods into their backyard. My grandmother would always act thrilled to see me, bustling about to whip up an after-school snack while I watched TV. It became a nice routine those first couple weeks. The hike there and back was so peaceful, just me and nature. But in late June, things started feeling off. I noticed the usual sounds of birds and squirrels had quieted. The woods seemed darker somehow. I shrugged it off as summer storm clouds rolling in. I should have turned around right then and there. I was about halfway to my grandparents' house when the first raindrops started falling. I pulled my hood up and continued on. Then crackling thunder echoed through the trees, much closer than expected. The wind picked up, whipping the branches around. It was still mid-afternoon, but the sky had turned an ominous gray-green. I quickened my pace, hoping to beat the storm. But the heavens opened up, rain coming down in blinding sheets. The ground turned to mud, rain dripping down my neck. I was soaked and shivering, but pushed on toward the warm, dry house ahead. Out of nowhere, a blood-curdling screech rang out, nothing like I'd ever heard from any local wildlife. I froze, peering desperately through the rain and shadows between the trees. A flickering light appeared, swaying erratically as if carried by someone walking. Had my grandfather come looking for me? I called out but received no answer over the cacophony of thunder and heavy rain. The light continued bobbing toward me, too short to be my tall grandfather holding a lantern. I stumbled backward, unsure what else it could be. The screech came again, closer this time. The strange light kept advancing between the trees. My heart pounded. I turned and sprinted blindly through the woods in the opposite direction. I didn't care that I was going deeper into unknown territory. I just had to escape that thing and the unearthly wailing. I splashed through mud and thorny brush, clothes snagging on branches. A bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree, the deafening crack ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of smoke filled my nose as rain hissed against the sizzling wood. Still, I careened on through the darkness, feet slipping out from under me. I crashed to the ground, tasting mud and blood in my mouth. The thing was closer now, its flickering light weaving between the trees. I scrambled to my feet and took off again just as another bolt struck right behind me, the force of it propelling me forward. I ran and ran until I thought my lungs would burst. My head throbbed and I gasped for breath, but I didn't dare stop. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I stumbled into a rocky clearing. An abandoned miner's shack stood against the far wall. I hurled myself at the weathered wooden door just as the shriek sounded right at the tree line. I forced the warped door shut behind me, plunging the shack into darkness. Shaking uncontrollably, I sank down against the wall, blood roaring in my ears. The thing outside continued to wail, a bone-chilling scream of anger and anguish. Exhausted, I must have passed out right there on the dirt floor. Because the next thing I remember is waking up in pitch blackness. The storm's fury diminished to a steady drizzle. The shack stood silent and still. Whatever was out there seemed to have moved on. Bleary and disoriented, I cautiously made my way outside. The moon peeked through clouds, providing just enough light to maneuver slowly through the trees, arms outstretched. I walked all night, terrified that things still lurked in the shadows waiting for me. By some miracle, I emerged from the woods as the sun rose, stumbling up to my own back porch. I burst inside, bolted the door, and collapsed on the floor, overcome with relief at being home. My parents never found out about that day's misadventure. The memory still haunts me, though, especially being back at home alone so much. Whatever sinister presence I encountered out there, I know deep down it's still lurking in those forests, waiting. I've never ventured beyond my backyard since. Some nights I still hear haunting screeches echoing through the trees, and I pray it never finds me again. Campsite Man, from Dan H. Camping used to be one of my favorite family activities. Getting out into nature, cooking over the fire, telling stories under the stars. What's not to love? My wife Emily and I took our son Jake camping every chance we got when he was growing up. But ever since what happened that weekend at the state park when Jake was 13, I don't think I'll ever be able to enjoy it the same way again. It was early October, perfect weather for camping before it got too cold. We drove up to one of our favorite spots, Ridgeview State Park, on a Friday afternoon. Our campsite was in a more secluded part of the park, surrounded by towering pines. After setting up the tent and getting a fire going, we cooked hot dogs for dinner. Jake was excited when the sun went down. I told him some spooky stories about monsters in the woods. He was at that age where scary stuff was thrilling rather than really frightening. Afterwards, we all turned in for the night, exhausted from the drive and the setup. The first night sleeping outdoors is always the best. So peaceful and quiet, tucked away in the tent, exhausted. The next morning, we made pancakes over the fire for breakfast. As we ate, a park ranger came by to welcome us to the campgrounds. He was an older guy, wiry with a big mustache. After some friendly small talk, he told us to be sure to store all food properly at night, as bears had been active lately. We assured him we had a bear-proof container that we always used when camping. After the ranger left, we headed out on a hike. Emily is a bird watcher, so she brought her binoculars and field guide to spot species. We saw kingfishers, robins, finches, and more over the next few hours. Jake did complain a bit about being bored, but I could tell he was enjoying himself too. Back at our site in the late afternoon, we played card games and read magazines. As dusk fell, I noticed a man at the site across the road from us. He would glance over more and more frequently as the night wore on. He looked to be around my age, 40s, kinda rough and grizzled. He was drinking a beer and smoking, while poking aimlessly at his fire. I tried to shrug it off, but something about the way he was watching us creeped me out. I made sure to usher Jake into the tent once it got dark, so that he was out of view. Emily and I stayed by the fire until almost midnight, chatting and gazing at the stars before finally turning in. Sometime later, I awoke suddenly to noises outside the tent. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I lay still, straining to identify these sounds. Next to me, Emily and Jake remained fast asleep. More crunching footsteps, seemingly right near the tent wall. Adrenaline began to pump in me as my mind went to the worst possible scenarios. A rabid animal, a psycho killer, the creepy camper from earlier. Moving slowly, as to not make much noise, I reached for my flashlight, which was nearby. I flipped it on and swept the beam around the interior. Nothing inside. The crunching footsteps continued, definitely circling just outside the nylon walls. Taking a deep breath, I unzipped the tent flap as quietly as I could. I stuck just my head out, prepared to face some wild animal snout to snout. But instead, the light revealed the man from the other side, now squatting just feet away, his back facing me. With the light at his back, the man whipped around suddenly. For a split second, we locked eyes, my blinding flashlight beam illuminating his face. I saw this wild, glassy look in his eyes before he snarled like some animal and lunged for me. I fell backwards into the tent, screaming for Emily and Jake to get out as the man scrambled to get through the tent entrance. Emily was awake instantly, grabbing Jake and pushing past me out of the tent. I kicked wildly at the man, now halfway inside our tent, aiming for his face. My heel connected with his mouth, and I heard him cry out. Finally, I wriggled away, ripping open the tent and bursting outside. Emily and Jake were already sprinting for the main site area. I grabbed my keys and a knife, slicing at the tent material as the man emerged from within. He came at me again, blood now dripping from his split lip. I managed to evade his grasp, then turned and ran after my fleeing family. We called for help, and within moments, other campers emerged from their tents. I yelled out that a man was trying to attack us, and I pointed to where he was now. I saw him disappearing into the trees beyond our now destroyed tent. The camp hosts called 911 while checking that we were all unharmed. The other campers searched the area, but found no sign of the attacker. The paramedics arrived shortly after, along with police, who took our statements. We elected not to stay another night, instead driving to a nearby hotel where I could hardly sleep. We left the following day, even more exhausted. Emily and I both had been shaken to the core. That feeling of security camping had always given me was gone. Jake especially was quiet on the drive home. He's 18 now, but hasn't gone camping since then. And to be honest, it took me quite a few years to feel comfortable camping again. Being out in the wilderness, once so peaceful, now seems full of unseen dangers lurking in the dark. Who knows who or what might end up at my tent door next time. Lost in the Woods. From Helen. Because of this experience, I try not to go hiking alone anymore. It gives me chills when I think back to how close I came to who knows what kind of danger had been out there. At the time, I was dating this guy named Brian. We'd been together about 6 months, and we liked going on outdoorsy dates. Hiking, kayaking, things like that. One Saturday, we decided to check out a new state park neither of us had been to, about 40 minutes outside the city. We got a late start that morning, and didn't arrive at the park until close to noon. It was a gorgeous day. We stopped at the little park office to grab a trail map. The ranger there highlighted what he said was a great 6-mile loop that would take us up to a waterfall overlook. Brian and I got boots and hydration packs on and hit the trail. We were having a good time, chatting and admiring the scenery. This trail started out wide and was well marked. Gradually, it climbed uphill. After about 45 minutes, we reached a fork that didn't seem to be on the map. We debated which direction to go. Eventually, Brian thought we should go left, since we could vaguely hear the sound of rushing water coming from that direction, assuming it was the waterfall we wanted to see. That path got progressively narrower and less maintained. The foliage grew thick on either side, limiting our views. Another 20 minutes in, I was starting to get nervous that we chose the wrong direction. But when I voiced my concerns, Brian brushed it off. It's just a little farther," he said. "If not the waterfall, then maybe something even better." Suddenly, the woods became extremely dense. We trekked through for several minutes, and when I finally came out on the other side into a clearing, Brian was gone. I called for him, but he didn't respond. How did that happen, I wondered. He'd been right there with me just a moment ago. I backtracked, getting more anxious when there was no sign of him. How could he have just vanished so quickly? The trail forked again up ahead, and neither branch looked familiar. I tried calling Brian's name again, but I was met once more with silence. I chose one of the paths blindly, deciding I just needed to get back to the main trail. But after walking for several more minutes, things were looking less and less recognizable. That's when the fear really hit home for me, that realization that I was truly lost and alone. The day was getting late, the sun dropping lower through the trees. I picked up the pace, hoping to find a trail marker or an intersection, anything familiar. My heart pounded as the woods grew dimmer. Strange noises echoed around me that I tried to block out. I could have sworn I heard footsteps crunching leaves some distance behind me at one point. But when I paused to listen, they went quiet. Out of water, tired and overwhelmed, I took a break, sitting on a fallen tree. I put my head in my hands, on the verge of tears. Just where the heck was I? Just then, a snapping twig made me jerk upright. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the woods around me. I saw it then, the silhouette of a tall, lone man, maybe 100 feet back, standing motionless among the trees. "Brian?" I called out, but immediately knew that was a mistake, because as I looked at him even a moment longer, I knew that couldn't be him. He was too tall. The shape just didn't match. And why would Brian ignore me? Panic filled me. I grabbed a nearby stick, the biggest one I could, and I shouted, "Stay away from me!" The man didn't move. He just stood there, blending into the shadows, watching me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I was not going to wait around to find out. I gripped my makeshift weapon, and I took off running again. Every few yards I glanced back, but I couldn't see the man anymore. I ran until my lungs burned, finally collapsing in a small clearing. By then, I was covered in sweat and shaking. I knew I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly out here. As the sunlight faded, I tried to gather myself and come up with a plan of some sort. Should I keep trying to find my way back? Do I make a shelter and spend the night? I had no idea where the trail was, or if that man was still tracking me. One thing was clear: I needed to leave these woods. Now. Sitting there alone as the shadows grew longer, I knew I had to keep moving. I took a deep breath and stood up, looking around for any clue of which way to go. In the distance, I thought I could hear the faint sound of traffic from a highway. If I could just follow that sound, it could lead me to a road, to people, to civilization. I started walking quickly toward where the noises came from, praying it wasn't just my imagination. My heart leapt at every snap of a twig and rustle in the brush. Was that weird man still tracking me? What did he want? I pressed on through the thickening darkness. The woods were full of sinister sounds, screeching birds, skittering animals in the underbrush, creaking branches. I kept glancing behind me, but saw nothing besides endless trees. Finally, the distant traffic noise grew more distinct. My spirits lifted, thinking I was close to an exit from this nightmare. Just as I picked up speed, a figure stepped suddenly from behind a tree directly in my path, only 30 feet ahead. I screamed as the tall silhouette blocked my path. It was that man, the same one before. Somehow he'd caught up to me. As he took a step closer towards me, I could now see his features in the fading light. They made my blood run cold. His face was horribly disfigured. Scarred, twisted flesh, that looked burned and shiny. He had stringy hair hanging over a cloudy eye, but his one good eye was fixed intensely on me as he approached. I froze, gripping my stick weapon, debating on whether to run or try and defend myself. The man's mouth, partly obscured by an unnatural bulge on his cheek, curled into a sinister grin. In a deep, raspy voice, he spoke. "What's your hurry? Stay a while." His tone sent a wave of terror through me. Every instinct shouted at me to get away from this deformed threat. As the man closed the gap between us, I swung my stick at him with all my might. He lurched sideways to dodge it, then lunged towards me. I turned and sprinted away, weaving through trees and underbrush. I could hear the man crashing through the foliage behind me, letting out an awful gurgling yell. He sounded enraged that I had slipped away. I pushed my aching legs as hard as they could go, but soon his heavy footsteps seemed to be gaining ground. I risked a glance back, only to see the snarling, melted face even closer behind me. Suddenly, I broke through the trees into a clearing. Right there in front of me was a parking lot and a road full of cars. The highway I'd heard was just adjacent, decently busy even in the night. An overwhelming relief washed over me at the sight of other people. I raced right into the lot, toward a family packing up their vehicle. They looked startled as I ran up to them in a panic, gasping for air, trying to explain to them the dangerous man chasing me. The father and teenage son scanned the tree line, then quickly got me into their SUV, locking the doors. The son called 911, while the parents tried to calm me down and give me some water. I could hardly speak. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, as my panic only slowly receded. We watched the woods for any sign of that man, waiting for the police to arrive. Soon, flashing lights cut through the dark parking lot as a patrol car pulled up. An officer came to the SUV, and I recounted what happened through the panicked sobs. She went to search the woods while her partner got my statement. But there was no trace of the terrifying man. The police drove me to the nearby station, where they pieced together I'd stumbled out of Ridgeview State Park and I'd wandered over 7 miles from the main trailhead. A call went out to rangers there, who eventually contacted Brian once he made it back to the parking area. He was a mess. He'd been just as lost and freaked out, wandering solo after we got separated. Reuniting with Brian at the station, he frantically apologized to me for insisting on continuing down the wrong path. When I told him about the disfigured man I saw, he comforted me, telling me that everything was all right now. That chilling image, though, that face, it still haunts my nightmares. I'll never know if that man was some deranged predator lurking in the woods, or just some realistic figment of my terrified mind. Either way, the ordeal left me with a lingering fear of trails and trees that closes in on me if I'm not right by someone's side. Wherever that place took me when I was lost, it's a nightmare I can never quite wake up from, always feeling that malicious presence just behind me in the shadows. My strange encounter. From Max. This happened a couple of years ago. It was a warm, late summer night. I was 16 years old, riding my 125cc through the village. I was just going out to clear my head. I was going through some difficult times, and the sound of a V-twin always calmed my nerves. Almost all of the ride was completely quiet and uneventful, giving me the peace and quiet I was looking for. I was going toward a dead-end road, which led to some lakes, so I could turn around and make my way back. About halfway through that road, I saw someone wearing all white, just walking down the road. Now, this wouldn't be too strange, as this was a common path for people to be taking for walks. However, it's a bit different when it's 11 p.m. in the middle of the night, and the person had no lights on them at all. And there are no houses along the 2-kilometer stretch of road, so I'm not sure what this person was doing. I slowed down out of instinct, because pedestrians can be unpredictable. That was a mistake. As I was about halfway past the person, they belted out the most violent-sounding scream I'd ever heard. My heart instantly started to race, and before I could figure out what was happening, the person charged at me, all while I frantically tried to get into the lowest gear possible. I saw the person in my mirror as I cracked the throttle all the way open. Now, for people that have no clue about engines, a 125cc is extremely low, and the initial acceleration on the one I had was barely faster than a person. It also didn't help that I had changed the front sprocket for a bigger one to save on gas by reducing cruising RPM. The throttle was still wide open, and as I was approaching 9,000 RPM, I was getting ready to shift. But that was when I felt a hand harshly hit the rear of my bike. Terrified, I ended up over-revving the bike all the way until 13,000 RPM because I didn't want to shift while that person was within arm's reach. This person kept up with me until I hit 27 kilometers per hour. At that point, I started to lose them. I didn't slow down. However, only after I'd lost sight of the person did I remember that this road ended in the forest. This caused me some more panic. As I approached the end of the road, I remembered that there was a small gravel path that's meant for hiking. This was also an older bike, so it still had a regular light switch. Usually more modern bikes have their lights set up so that you can't turn them off when the engine's running. Instinctively, I turned off the lights as I shifted all the way into 5th gear to make the least amount of noise possible. I followed the gravel path all the way back to a regular road. I was speeding, and I was constantly looking behind me. Even as I got onto the regular road, I continued to speed. When I finally made it back home, I was trembling, soaked in sweat. I opened my garage door and stored away my motorcycle, while still looking at my surroundings the entire time. I ran to my door as fast as I could, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it too, just to be safe. The following day, I called one of my friends. I told him about the night before, asking him to come along with me this time. We took a hike into the forest, which was right next to the road, looking for tracks, because I thought someone had set up some stupid prank. But I couldn't find anything. The only tracks that were there were mine and my friends. I searched both sides of the forest, along the entire road, but I found nothing. I'm usually not someone to get scared easily, and I'm no small guy either. I'm 185 centimeters tall, and I have an athletic build. But that scream, I've never heard anything like it, and it sent chills down my spine. I get spooked just thinking about that horrible sound. I've told this story to 3 of my friends before. They took me seriously, as I usually don't scare too easily, and I'm not one to make stuff up. This was the most frightening encounter I've had while riding my 125 at night. Looking back on it, I feel like I could have fought the person off, especially because I was wearing full motorcycle gear. But I'm telling you, when I heard that scream, my mind just told me to run. It was so loud, and it didn't sound human. I've avoided that road ever since, and I don't ever intend to go to that road again. I still don't know what that person was doing there, in the middle of the night, without a single light, in the middle of nowhere, wearing all white. There are no asylums anywhere nearby, so I don't think it was an escapee. But still, I can't come up with a logical explanation to this. Thank you for stopping by at our little campsite here at Camping Horrors. To hear your story on the show, send it to us for narration at darkstories.org. For more narrations from me, you can catch me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Or you can go to eeriecast.com for those and even more terrifying podcasts. Follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Prevails, and be sure to leave Camping Horrors a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now then, I'll see you soon when the campfire blazes once again.